I think the first panelist that I would like to invite here is Mr. Peter Kallang, who came and waiting since the morning. Thank you so much for that. I think many of us have heard about Peter. Peter based in Malaysia, and he himself is from Kenya, one of the Borneo indigenous ethnic group. And from what we know about him, he has been an activist throughout his working time and very well known as a knowledgeable person for the folklore and the traditions of the indigenous groups in Malaysia. And Peter has been established and served for numbers of the indigenous network, including the Orang Ulu National Association, the Pasatun Kenya Miri, that in order to preserve the tradition of the Kenya community. And I think the most known of Peter for all of us is relating to the struggle against the Hydropower Dam in Sarawak. I think in the early 2000s, when the Sarawak state planned to construct 12 hydropower dams, and then the group of the civil society formed a coalition called Save River. And Peter served as the Save River Coalition founding chairman. And Save River Network played a key role in stopping the Daoroung Dam, which is a successful story for the hydropower dam struggle. So I think today we are going to hear from Peter about that as well. And we're really happy to have Peter with us today. So Peter, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Premrudee. Greetings to all viewers, and my congratulations to the webinar organizing team for organizing this event, Mio. And thank you very much for this privilege you have for giving this opportunity for me to speak at the webinar. I know the amount of work, I can imagine rather, the amount of work that you put in order to organize this. I will just straight away launch into what I want to share with you. Now we are in the middle of this lockdown and COVID-19 pandemic. So this is something that we did not imagine would happen. Let's say about 3-5 years ago. We never imagined it. But today there is another. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I had some echo and all that. Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Yeah, there is another impending threat, that's global threat for all of us, which at one time was a discourse among academics and specialists. But today it is something that is very real. A lot of us may not know, especially the men on the street, they may not know what is the cause, what is happening, but the impact of this threat is happening to them. So I would like to go, can we go to the first slide, please, Moderator? This is a second threat. Okay, okay, now you go. So this is what we are talking about is the threat of global warming. And then the solution is through natural solution, ICCA. I will explain to you what this all means later on. Okay, we go to the next slide. So I'm sure like what was shown in that earlier video with the start, what we're seeing now is impact of what is now known as global warming. We in Southeast Asia are not spared from the impact. The impact is impacting not only human life, but also the biodiversity, all the flora and fauna, and then all over Southeast Asia, either in Borneo, in Thailand, in the Philippines. You can see the constant flood and impacting on the livelihood of the people and the supply chains. And then we can see also extreme weather pattern. At times we have a lot of rain until we have flood. Like here in Borneo, my part of Borneo, for the last 2 months, we have had 3 floods occurring. Rarely, it comes into the living room and be up to about almost a meter high in some places. And then at some time you have dry season at a long 1 month or so, and then it affect the crops and all that. Okay, you go to the next slide. So what is the cause of this? I'm trying to go to the basic in case because I believe there is a wide range of people who are watching the webinar. Some are experts, some may be very young. So how is it that happen? Sorry. Yeah. So this is all caused by human activities, actually. So let's go to the next slide. I don't know where I was not heard. Okay. So the natural way for controlling carbon sink, of course, is from all these what do you call forests that we have. Like what I said earlier on, the climate change is global warming is caused by radiation, which is because of human activities from our fossil fuel usage of fossil fuel, from burning for plantations, which occur a lot in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, with the highest exporter of oil palm. All this because of the big plantations that we are building, developing, and also, of course, all these power plants that we are doing. We have smelting plant and all that going on. All these are breathing out fumes into the air and causing greenhouse gases. Let's go to the next one. So I would like to share with you this video, which is explain how we can resolve this phenomena of greenhouse gas. Can we put on the video?
I'm sorry. I'm very sorry about that. You think
Indigenous peoples are very
have you
actively
been
engaged in conserving the environments, their own ecosystems, because this is where they live. These are their traditional territories, and they have been the ones who have played key roles in conserving a lot of the biodiversity in those territories. In fact, many scientific reports would show that the indigenous peoples occupy like 5% of the world's territories, but 80% of the biodiversity is found in their territory. Many of them have been evicted from their territories when these have been designated as national parks or conservation areas. There is this belief that for this area to be conserved, the people should be removed from these areas, but in reality, the better preserved areas are the areas where the indigenous peoples are. So these kinds of displacements are violations of their rights to their lands, territories, and resources. Secondly, the livelihoods that they depend on, like they are hunters and gatherers. Many of them are pastoralists. A lot of them are agricultural. They are agroforestry producers. And these kinds of livelihoods are deprived. They are deprived of this livelihood, so it leads towards even more poverty and misery, because many indigenous peoples, like for instance in some parts of Africa, they are now, the pygmies are along the highways in the fringes of the national parks, and they can hardly fend for themselves. That in the name of conservation, indigenous peoples are removed from their lands, and this is justified under the rules of protected areas set up by governments. But actually, what I'm trying to stress in my report is that these people have the inherent rights to these lands and territories, and even if these are designated as protected areas, they should be able to have a system where they co-manage the protected areas jointly with the government.
can you hear me? Are we going
Yes.
back? Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Did you see the video?
I saw that.
All right.
Was
I'm
it
very
seen by
sorry.
other people as well?
Yeah. All right.
Okay, fine.
Okay. Please continue, Peter. I'm very sorry for the technical problem. Yeah.
No problem.
All right.
Now we can share the PowerPoint, if you please. Thank you. The next slide. Can you see my screen? You want me to share? Premrudee? Shall I say? Can you see that? Okay. So earlier on, you saw this video, which is given by Paulus. Excuse me if I cannot pronounce her name well. Was serving in the United Nations at one time. What she said there was almost 80% of the conserved area or still intact forest in the whole world is in the areas where the indigenous people are living. And the indigenous people are contributing to the conservation of nature because of their spiritual belief, because of the way they do farming and all that, the tradition and culture. So that is why it is very important for us to look at contribution of the indigenous people in the conservation, in trying to maintain and preserve the carbon sink that we already have given by nature to us. So And we in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, 3 of the countries I just pick here, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, we are the most, what I would say, the biodiversity, global biodiversity, 20% of the biodiversity in the whole world. So 30% of the global mangrove areas are found in these 3 countries, which is part of ASEAN. More than 2,000 animal species are found here, home to 800 different indigenous communities and indigenous peoples are found here. And this, like what I said earlier on, these are the people, because of the custom, culture, spiritual belief and all that, are supporting the conservation of all this carbon sink that we have. We are contributing to the world, in fact, not only in ASEAN. So that's why, and 30% of the global coral reefs that we have. So that's why we are really, really blessed that we have all this here. We have not counted the other ASEAN countries because there are 10 ASEAN countries. They are also contributing their part. So this is the wealth that we have in ASEAN, which we should promote and protect. And then, so the indigenous community, it is sometimes called the Indigenous Community Conservation Area, or in short, ICCA. In Indonesia, more than 11 million hectares of ICCA land are already mapped and uploaded with the support in collaboration with the indigenous people. They map out and included in what they call the one map system for the whole of the Indonesian, all the Indonesian archipelago. Yeah. Here in Malaysia, I'm personally involved, our NGO, Save Rivers, in a forest area in Upper Baram, where a lot of it has been degraded forest, but there are still about 28% left intact natural forest. And then there are more than 32 villages there in that area. And then we are really glad that government have endorsed it and then have submitted it to the ITTO, the International Tropical Timber Organization, and ITTO has endorsed it. So we have started having fund coming in so that we can start this area for conservation. And the beauty of this area that we are proposing is it is a collaboration between the government, the state government of Sarawak, Malaysia, the forest department, the communities there, and civil society organization and NGO. In the Philippines, 85% of the remaining forests overlap with ICCA. Study done on just 10 of these ICCA has carbon storage equivalent to gas emission of 7 million cars per annum. This is really great. So this is what we have now, the wealth that we have, which we should keep and try to maintain and try to improve, enhance. Now I'm stuck. Cannot move for some reason. Let me just get out of. Let me just stop sharing for a bit and then come back. Is that okay? Let's try again. Now, under this convention, the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity back in 2004, ICCA recognized in a range of decisions. Yeah? So in Malaysia, ICCA in National Biodiversity Strategy, it is incorporated inside there. In the Philippines has a strong legal framework for indigenous people's right. So in other words, we automatically believe that they respect this ICCA in the country. But sad to say, the social and environmental aspect often exceeded by the economic focus. This is not only true in Malaysia, I believe it is true in most of our ASEAN countries, especially in developing countries like ours. We can see there is a big gap between the policy in place and the implementation. We take as example the construction of the dam in Tumandok, Dumangat, Agartha, Krumatro in the Philippines. Sorry if I pronounce that badly. This is one case where the indigenous people are protecting their land, but the authority is building dams there. They are facing with a lot of challenges. And then I think you can refer it, if you Google it, what happened in November, December last year, 2020, what happened there. And then here in Malaysia, during this lockdown, where people are not allowed to move because of the pandemic, this logging and big scale agricultural plantation is going unimpeded. There's nobody controlling that. They're going. And in fact, a lot of illegal logging are done, intruding into the ICCA. And then in Myanmar, the military junta bombed award-winning Karen Peace Park. So this is very sad. We should not put our economic focus higher than the human right and conservation of the ICCA. Because if you don't respect ICCA, one day, whatever you gain from your economic gains will mean nothing because of the climate change.
I guess you have a few minutes left, Peter.
Yeah, I'm about to. And now I'm stuck again. Let me just. So, Indonesia, sorry. Yeah. So that is where I was. Now I just show you two maps. This is what happened in Myanmar. You can see on the all this. You can see all this red mark on the map. This is what a bombing did to the Selwyn Peace Park. And then here in Sarawak, in Malaysia, Borneo, this is upper Baram forest area that I was talking about. We are trying our best to make sure that this will happen. So thank you very much. Tiga Tawai in my dialect, Sayu Kenap in another dialect in Sarawak. Bian Kenin is by the what do you call the nomadic tribe in the Penan in Sarawak. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think what Peter has been covering for us is many of the key issues varies from the indigenous issues to the climate change, and also the struggling of the indigenous groups all over the region. And I think that will lead to many more details that we are going to hear from 2021 in the coming 6 days, I think. And later on, I think probably we will hear some questions from our audience online. Very lucky, now we have all of our speakers here. We have Dr. Walden Bello here with us already. And Walden, good morning from here. I know you are now in the US and you might have some jet lag, but very much thank you that you are joining us. I think probably I will invite Walden to speak first before we move to another, our two ladies panelists today. Let me introduce Walden to all of you a little bit. Actually, for us in Thailand, I think we have known Walden since his famous book, A Siamese Tragedy, The Development and Disintegration in Modern Thailand. That I think it was end of 1990 that Walden wrote, the book, together with Shear Cunningham. And Walden is a very well-known person as an academic, the environmentalist, and also the social workers who serve as a member of the House of Representatives of the Philippines as well in a certain period of time. Walden is also a professor at Binghamton University, which I think he's now there, and also the professor in the University of the Philippines, Diliman. And in 1995, Walden co-founded Focus on the Global South, the Policy Research Institute that based in Bangkok, and that made us having a chance to see Walden a bit more. And now he's the board of this progressive group Focus. So I think Walden today, what we were expected is that we will hear from Walden a little bit back to the historical context of ASEAN or Southeast Asia, a little bit of the geopolitics that we are facing, and probably Walden can tell us about what he's seeing now, a little bit of the future after this pandemic as well, if you like. Okay, Walden, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, and good morning. It is evening here, and I hope you can hear me well. I just this last few hours got off my flight from Manila, so I might be a bit jet lagged and I might not make a lot of sense, but don't worry, I'm taking some whiskey to keep me awake. Let me just begin by saying that I think that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations shares something significant with the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC. They have lots and lots, in fact, hundreds of meetings, but very little of substance comes from these meetings. And a number of you have probably attended some of these ASEAN committee meetings and are quite frustrated, that, there's a lot of talk, but very little action. So I think the motto of ASEAN is, let's talk, but let's really not act on things. And this has been really the guiding spirit of ASEAN over, the last few decades since its founding in 1967. Well, initially, ASEAN, when it was founded, consisted of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and then in Singapore, and then it was joined by Brunei a few years later. And then there was a major expansion in the late 1990s that brought in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. And there is, of course, the prospective membership of Timor-Leste, which is still in process of being considered. Now, people say that ASEAN has made a contribution to regional security in the sense that it has helped prevent armed conflicts from taking place among its members. I think, if you're talking about minimum standards, this might be said to be, quote unquote, an accomplishment. Over the last, say, 20 years, for instance, there have been few, probably just one sort of armed conflict which has taken place between ASEAN member countries, and that was armed confrontation that took place over the Prayer Vihar temple between Cambodia and Thailand. There have been, of course, tensions between countries. For instance, in the 60s and 70s, there was the conflict over claims to Sabah, pitting the Philippines and Malaysia. Back in the 60s, and there was the confrontasi between Indonesia and Malaysia, when it comes to reducing the possibilities of armed conflicts as a minimum standard for judging ASEAN, perhaps, yes, we can maybe concede it has made some contribution to reducing armed conflicts over the last 20 years. Before that, of course, was a different story. So ASEAN evolved in the beginning with two main impulses, a strong one and a weak one. A strong impulse in the very beginning was anti-communism. And, for all intents and purposes, ASEAN in its first 2 decades was a pro-Western organization. In the late 70s, for instance, and the 1980s, ASEAN took a leading role in opposing Vietnam in the conflicts in the old Indochina Peninsula. And a large part of that was fear of communist expansion. Then there was a weaker impulse, and this was sort of a desire for some neutrality or some non-involvement in the fight among the superpowers. And here we can see this weak impulse towards neutrality when it comes to several very important documents. The ASEAN as a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, which was signed in I believe it was in the 1970s, and the ASEAN nuclear weapons-free zone, that declared ASEAN basically as nuclear weapons-free. But I would say that this was a weaker impulse to the stronger anti-communist impulse in the first few decades of ASEAN. When it comes to certain key issues like human rights, I think it is fair to say that ASEAN has had a very poor record. And I think there have been two major blocks to ASEAN taking a more stronger proactive role when it comes to human rights. One is the consensus process of decision-making, where there has to be a consensus on an issue, before ASEAN can even declare something on it, much less act on it. And the second thing is the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of member countries, which has really been a very, very strong block towards ASEAN's taking a really active role when promoting human rights. Okay, and we can see that, and when we look at the case of Myanmar, to just take a more recent development. Now, of course, this does not mean that rhetorically ASEAN has not made statements on human rights. In fact, ASEAN made a declaration on human rights. I believe this was around, I'm not sure now the date, 2000. But even that declaration of ASEAN was criticized by many as a sort of putting conditions on the respect and implementation of the human rights as articulated by the United Nations. I think we can see the recent Myanmar situation as a debacle on the part of ASEAN. Yes, ASEAN said, because of pressures coming from different directions, that it would have a policy of engagement in Myanmar. But ever since the coup of February of this year, in the statements that the ASEAN principal parties, led mainly by Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, have been pushing, there's more of a concern about, hey, we need some regional stability. This is why there must be internal peace in Myanmar. So there was not really a concern for human and democratic rights. And then there was no condemnation of the attacks on ethnic minorities in Myanmar. There was no call for the release of political prisoners. There was even no demand for a guarantee to see Aung San Suu Kyi. And the person who was appointed to be the envoy to Myanmar is a diplomat who has not really been engaged in human rights diplomacy. This is, the second foreign minister of Brunei, deputy, I believe. As far as I know, up to this point, the junta in Myanmar has not given him permission to see Aung San Suu Kyi. And, the ASEAN principal countries, governments, have not, in fact, pushed this. So you can see that this rhetoric of engagement is really a cover for being as soft as possible. And in this case, as soft as possible to the junta. Instead of treating the junta as a regime that has to be kept at a distance in the ASEAN engagement in Myanmar, it is being seen as a negotiating partner, which means that ASEAN is in fact extending legitimacy to the junta in Myanmar, which is why many people have from the very beginning opposed ASEAN's engagement when it refused to make a condemnation of the illegal character of the regime, knowing that ASEAN would just, go into this process of talk, which even by itself legitimizes the existence of the junta. So far, the ASEAN engagement with Myanmar has really been a process of extending legitimacy to the junta. You can see this, for instance, another aspect of this is the Philippine government, for instance, which I'm more familiar with, has really made no official statement on the military junta, except some soft personal statements from our foreign secretary or foreign minister, about, restoring the status quo, but that was not a formal statement. And the reason for this is very clear, okay? There's been a deal. Maybe it's not written down, but it is implicit between the junta and the Duterte government, which has been under a lot of attack for human rights violations, for extrajudicial executions. Hey, we'll be silent on what you've done if you'll be silent about our record of thousands of extrajudicial executions. So the Philippines is not, in fact, one of these principal parties engaged with Myanmar, precisely because of this informal deal of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, which means I won't talk about human rights in your country or about democratic rights if you are not going to talk about human rights in my country. Now, aside from Myanmar, the other big issue that has really engaged ASEAN over the last 20 years has been the South China Sea, or what we call West Philippine Sea issue. The countries that are in the very direct confrontation with China around recognition of their rights to the South China Sea or West Philippine Sea, the recognition of their exclusive economic zone rights, for instance, that recognition of their territorial rights, and this is the Philippines and Vietnam, have only had soft support from other members of ASEAN when it comes to pushing China to respect ASEAN or the rights of ASEAN member states. And not only have they not had strong support, some ASEAN member countries have not been sympathetic to supporting the rights of ASEAN member states, meaning Vietnam and the Philippines in particular, although Indonesia, Malaysia, are also, important as affected parties in the South China Sea issue. Because of that, ASEAN has been practically paralyzed, practically because of the veto of Cambodia and to some extent Laos on this issue. The last major common statement that ASEAN had made was really the declaration for a code of conduct in the South China Sea that it agreed upon with China. But that was the last. And China has been quite successful in splitting or neutralizing ASEAN member countries by saying that, hey, we don't want to deal with you as a multilateral body, but we'll deal with you on a bilateral basis. So let's do it country to country and not multilaterally. So I think that to some extent, China has been quite successful in splitting the ASEAN when it comes to this, you know, to this issue. Okay, so let me just, you know, make you know, a few more points. One of the important peacemaking mechanisms that emerged from ASEAN that was especially promising in the late 1990s was the ASEAN Regional Forum. And there was a momentum to the ASEAN Regional Forum. And I think part of that momentum was promoted by people like the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Muhammad Mahathir. And the ASEAN was emerging as a sort of diplomatic multilateral organization that would be very much, you know, the arbiter of conflicts in the area, especially superpower conflicts. And the ASEAN Regional Forum, I believe it met yearly, brought together at its core the ASEAN member states, and beyond that, it brought in the United States, it brought in China, et cetera, et cetera. So it was the ASEAN Regional Forum, but at the core of it was the ASEAN member countries. Unfortunately, the ASEAN Regional Forum did not really emerge as a diplomatic mechanism for the resolution of conflicts, although it still meets regularly. Why did it not emerge? There were two reasons for this. One was the Asian financial crisis of 1997, 1998. I think that because the ASEAN countries were very much affected by this, they were the ones at the forefront of the ASEAN Regional Forum, their sort of credibility suffered a lot from their loss of economic status. Because as you know, before the Asian financial crisis, they were seen as the tiger cubs that were really going to make a very, very important efforts at becoming developed countries. But after the Asian financial crisis, they lost that status. And in fact, they haven't really recovered the economic status they had since 1997. The other thing was the United States played an active role in making sure that it would be the axis of military and alliance diplomacy in the region. President Clinton made this very clear back in 1996, where he said, that it is really the United States that, that provides the security for the region. Well,
there's no other body. I'll give you a few more minutes, please.
Sure, yeah. I'm about to finish.
All right.
There's no other body that can substitute for the United States as a peacemaker. So, so those two factors, the Asian financial crisis and the sabotage by the United States of the emergence of the ARF as a diplomatic mechanism for peacemaking, accounted for the failure of the ASEAN Regional Forum after initial successes. So let me just sum up what the main points of what I have said. One is that I have to put this crudely, is ASEAN is all talk and no action. And that's the first thing. You know, the second thing, you know, that I would say is that yes, ASEAN might have contributed to reducing conflicts among its member countries, but that is a very minimum standard, okay? Armed conflicts. Third is that the biggest block to ASEAN has been its two main decision mechanisms, which is only consensus. After consensus, can you embark on a core of action? And secondly, non-interference in the internal affairs of member states, like promoting human rights or criticizing violations of human rights. Finally, there are two areas where we can see ASEAN being very ineffective at this point. And one is the ASEAN engagement with Myanmar, which really has done nothing but legitimize the junta, okay, by this process of engaging it as a negotiating partner, when in fact it should be engaging the Aung San Suu Kyi government, which is the legal government of Myanmar. And the second issue has been ASEAN's ineffectiveness on the attacks, on the encroachments of China, on the rights of its economic rights and territorial rights of its member countries in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, because of division within ASEAN that China has been able to exploit. And finally, let us not forget, you know, that when it comes to trying to provide for a diplomatic mechanism for regional security, ASEAN has faced the opposition of the United States, which until now sees itself as the only force that can provide region-wide security to the Pacific region. So let me just end there, and thank you again for inviting me to participate. I hope I have made sense, and you know that I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Walden. I think what Walden just said is reflecting a lot of what we're observing about ASEAN. Of course, the matter with Myanmar recently have shown us quite a lot about the, you know, the history of ASEAN haven't been changing a lot. And of course, for us who have been working on ASEAN, we recognize that the environment issues, which is linking to many issues, including human rights and many aspects of the life of the peoples in ASEAN have not been addressed very clearly. So apart from the ASEAN history, back to the, you know, military, the fear of the communism, as Walden told us, some of the very interesting insights as well. I think this issue specifically on ASEAN, the geopolitics and so on will be discussed further. I think our friend from ASEAN who is going to participate in MAO 2020 as well might also touch up on the issues that Walden mentioned to us. So and yes, I hope, Walden, you can stay with us for a little while for the questions later on as well. Thank you again. So our next panelist here, I would like to invite Kun Angkana Neelaphaijit. Of course, us in Thailand familiar with the works of Kun Angkana. who is he's the former member of the National Human Rights Commission. But years before she was working with the National Human Rights Commission, Angkana has been working dealing with the human rights issues for quite a long time. The Thai society might have known her towards the issues of the disappearance of her husband, who is also the human rights lawyer. But Kun Angkana has been continuing working on the issues of human rights and covering more issues, especially in her work with the National Human Rights Commission. So I think for today, Kun Angkana will cover with us about the issues of the rights, which is covering more than one group. I understand she will also talking about the workers, the rights of the children, and also about the community that have been affected by the large-scale project in the region. And I understand this came from what the direct work that she has been involved with in the past years. Kun Angkana, please.
Thank you very much, Kun Premrudee, and good morning, everyone. I'm really privileged to be here to join the very important event of Mekong and ASEAN environment. When many countries are very proud of ASEAN solidarity, but many times that ASEAN ignore the outcry of our people and our citizens. And there are many groups of vulnerable people who always left behind. The limitation of freedom of speech and peaceful assembly were prohibited in many countries, especially under the military government. Judicial harassment often used to stop human rights defenders and activists for their struggle for democracy and justice. During the COVID-19, many people were left behind, especially the vulnerable, the indigenous people, the ethnic minorities, migrant workers, refugees. And we can see the uprising of young generation asking for democracy, equality, and non-discrimination. And this shows us that it's time to make change for better ASEAN, and everyone must be inclusiveness. Walden already shown us the big picture of ASEAN and human rights. For me, I will sharing with you the suffering of ASEAN people and how we have to join hand in hand to solve these problems. The ASEAN member states could not rely on this anymore. The voices of people must be heard, and their dignity and value must be respected. Please, the next slide, please. Yes, the first sharing thing in ASEAN is about migration. And regarding to conflict and armed conflict and poverty, many ASEAN people have to migrate to neighboring countries as refugees, asylum seekers, or migrant workers, and some are internal displaced persons. Unfortunately, some of them are victims of trafficking. For the migrant workers, during the COVID-19, a lot of migrant workers lost their job and they lost their income, and it's affected a lot to their families, both in the country of origin and the country that they work. And many times that when the migrant workers face the human rights violation, it's difficult for them to complain. We can see the popular case in Thailand, the case of 14 Myanmar workers who work in Thai poultry farm that faced a lot of criminal lawsuits when they complain about their rights when working in the farm. The migrant workers will be more vulnerable if they are illegal or undocumented workers. Most of them are living in fear. They don't know when they will be arrested and what will happen to their family. Most of them staying in uncertain situations and worried about the family behind, and there's no guarantee of their future, especially their children. Even in Thailand, the government allowed the children of migrant workers to access education, but if they have, if the children have no house legislation, so that they cannot access to school, and psychosocial traumas often affect to this happen. I want to focus on the rise of the child when people migrate to neighboring countries. They often brought their children with them, and children on the move is one of our concerns. When the families were arrested, maybe if they are the refugees, asylum seekers, or legal migrants, the children will be in detention facilities with their families, and they cannot access to education. They cannot have the good development, well-being. Then children cannot go to school, and they cannot access to public health services, especially the vaccination. Could you please turn the next slide? Next slide. Okay. And for Thailand, they have some progressive that on 2019, Thailand have announced to end child detentions, so that when I'm the Human Rights Commissioner and investigate the lot of cases of children in detention facilities, I found that some children die in detention, and the detention facilities, the detention center is not the place that people have to stay for a long time. Maybe some of them were detained more than 10 years, and many of them died. So I think that for the migration, for illegal migration, for refugees and asylum seekers, I think we should start with children's rights. No, children have to stay outside the detention facilities, and their families also. How can ASEAN allow the refugees, asylum seekers, or legal migrants? How can they work in the country when they are waiting to go to the third country? I think this is very challenges to ASEAN. Next slide, please. Second challenges I want to mention is about enforced disappearance in ASEAN. On Monday, 21st, this week, the UN working groups on enforced or involuntary disappearances said in the presenting its annual report to the 48th session of Human Rights Council. A group of UN human rights experts expressed alarm on the disappearance of people while being expelled from one country to another. I quote, the experts said, although we have received allegations concerning a number of countries on almost every continent, we likely are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Next, please. May I show you some cases of enforced disappearance in ASEAN about the asylum seeker in ASEAN that disappear in many countries. The first case I want to share with you is about the case of Thai dissidents. Since 2016 to 2020, 9 Thai dissidents disappeared from Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia when they brought a lot of warrant and when they spread to neighboring countries. Most of them are political activists and anti-military government. Later, 2 from 9 found dead in Mekong River. The investigation was dropped last year, and the fate and whereabouts of the disappeared remain unknown. Next slide, please. The second case I want to share with you is about the disappearance of the Sayawong that disappeared on September 2019. Mr. Sayawong is a Laos refugee recognized by UNHCR, and he stayed in Bangkok, waiting to go to the third country. He was a member of Free Laos, and he disappeared in center of Bangkok. The disappearance of Mr. Sayawong was investigated by the Thai Department of Special Investigation, or the DSI. But until now, his fate and whereabouts still unknown. And I found that in ASEAN countries, they have no cooperative investigation among member states on the case of trans-border disappearance. And rights to truth and reparations of the victims are denied by ASEAN states. Next slide, please. The third challenges of ASEAN is about trans-boundary investment. There's a lot of ASEAN people who lost their land and forests according to mega project and investment in ASEAN. And most people who affected by this mega project are the indigenous people and their communities. The loss of national resources, sometimes the investment create the pollution, for example, air pollution or water pollution, and they have no effective remedies. For the indigenous people, we can see that they have no public hearing with the indigenous people. Sometimes the government organize the public hearing, but some of the indigenous cannot understand about the national language because most of them are using their mother tongue language. And it seems that their voices never been heard. Next slide, please. Some emblematic trans-boundary cases that we know very well and it affected to lots of people. For example, the Dam construction project on Salawin River, the Sayaburi Dam in Laos, the electricity plant in Phong Sa, Laos, that is the product a lot of electrics and sent to Thailand, Malaysia, but it's left nothing to the communities in Laos. And the huge concession and land acquisitions of Kok Pong and Ordinances province in Cambodia. The Ordinances project in Cambodia is very interesting that today the communities came to Thailand and complained to the Thai court, asking for remedies from the Thai company. The case is still going on, and regarding to COVID-19 is postponed many times. But if you are interested, I think that Thai colleague or others of you who interested can observe the trial at the South Civil Court of Thailand, how the Cambodian community can access to effective remedies. It's a kind of judicial remedy, but I think this is the first case in Thailand. But I think we have to see what will happen. Another project that I want to raise is the construction of dam in China and rusting of its lake in Mekong River. This is very concerned that, by many countries in ASEAN. Next slide, please. The most important thing, and I think this is what we have to concern, is about democracy in ASEAN. As our colleague mentioned earlier about the coup d'etat in Myanmar or the military government in Thailand. That please, next slide, please. Because for ASEAN, we often talk about the ASEAN value. The youth have to listen to the senior people. But now I think that the new generation, they are growing up, and I think that democracy is very meaningful to everyone, because the democracy guarantee the equal rights of the people, the rights to access education, the social welfare, gender equality, the rights to work, and non-discrimination regarding to race, sex, color, religions, or belief. Democracy also allow everybody, all stakeholders, to inclusiveness, to design their own society, and especially all the voices must be heard. Freedom of expression is one thing that's most concerned in ASEAN countries. The rights to speak, the rights of journalists, the access to information of people, that many times that is prohibited by laws or regulation in many countries in ASEAN. And many countries use some law. For example, in Thailand, the Computer Crime Acts often used to prosecute the human rights defenders or journalists or the political activists to be silent. And I think this must be amended. And if ASEAN not want to listen to the youth or to the people who difference, I think this will destroy our society. Right to peaceful assembly is also must be respected by the government of ASEAN, because during COVID-19, I think that everyone knows that everywhere they have the protest, because people are suffering from many things. They cannot access to food, they cannot access to health services. So in many countries, they often organize the assembly, even the online protests. So this is very important, how people can tell what happened to them. And for ASEAN, I think it's time to stop the militarization in ASEAN. And well-being and human security of ASEAN should be recognized and should be priority for ASEAN countries. And this is the aim of our future. Many times that ASEAN often talk about the national security, but they have no definition, they have no clear definition of what is national security, why people are still poor. They cannot access food, they cannot access to health services. And when we talk about national security, why our people still suffering. So it's the time to talk about the well-being of people and human security. Next, please. I have some recommendations to ASEAN state. First, ASEAN state and business sector to ensure to respect the human rights with envisioning the roles of business and the SDGs. Second, encouraging the embed of human rights respect as a responsibility across the value supply chains of business operation with robust human rights due diligence. Third, ASEAN should ensuring of effective remedies provided for those facing adverse business-related human rights impacts. Fourth, protecting, respecting, and supporting human rights defenders is needed. Five, ASEAN should guarantee the right to life, the right not to be disappeared, right not to be tortured or extrajudicial killing. So people who think different should have rights on their life. And six, ASEAN should ratify the Refugee Convention 1951. Seven, ASEAN states should end child detention. And eight, ensure that rights of indigenous people will be respected in line with international human rights law. And indigenous people must be included in all policy making that affected to their communities. 9, ASEANs must develop guidelines for responsible investments and including outbound investment in National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And 10, amended ASEAN Charter's non-interference and consensus as Walden mentioned earlier. Last but not least, role of women is very important. ASEAN often talk about the ASEAN value and women must be behind men, and sometimes some countries we cannot talk about gender equality. But during the conflict and armed conflict, women have a critical role to prevent the conflict or all kinds of violence. So ASEAN countries should adopt the UN Security Council 1325, Women, Peace and Security, and have the National Action Plan on Women's Security to allow women to be mediators and negotiators to avoid the conflict and violence in ASEAN. And for our better future, the COVID-19 pandemic showed us the unequal society. The pandemic exposed yet again the charms between the rich and the poor, stigmatized and discriminations. The lesson we learned from COVID-19 is how important the state welfare should be adopted to guarantee the well-being of all people, especially those who are vulnerable. ASEAN states must respectfully the rights, dignity, and value of ASEAN people. It must take all mechanisms to prevent and stop violations, provide redress and accountability, and ensure that violations are not repeated. And ASEAN must be transparency and accountability to the people, listen to the outcries of people and activities, and publicly respond to human rights crises, including through the creation of a complaint mechanism that is accessible to vulnerable individuals and groups, and the enhancement of engagement with civil societies as equal partner for the promotion and protection of human rights in the region. Next, please. Many decades of silence is enough, and it's time to start new era by giving a chance to the hand of our new generations to build our nations with democracy, hope, resilience, and well-being on the benefit of our people. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Kun Angkana within the time that she has. Kun Angkana was sure ensure us about all the very important issues that we are facing in ASEAN, and probably the issues that we not really hear a lot from the function that the mechanism of ASEAN itself. Of course, from the issues of democracy to enforce disappearance and transboundary investment. I think what we have heard at the last part of Angkana presentation about what we need for ASEAN is really a key or the heart of what we are thinking about. Probably later on, we can try to hear more from Angkana about the possibility to really make our regional mechanism to engage to all these problems more, including maybe the mechanism within ASEAN, like the AISHA, the ASEAN Intergovernment Commission on Human Rights. Probably we can come back to that a bit in a while. Thank you again, Angkana. And I think we are now going to our final, last but not least, the final speaker, Kong Somonicheat. She is a senior majoring in the international studies at the Royal University of Phnom Penh. I think she's still, but at the same time, Somonicheat is now working as a media and communication officer at the organization based in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, the Social Action for Community and Development. And from what we understand, Somonicheat has been working a lot in many of the youth-led networks to advocate the voice of the young people and trying to influence the Cambodian government in the issues of the accountability, especially in the issues of the policies that came out, which is also related to the youth in the country. And I think what we have heard from before is that the special interest of Somonicheat is how can we open more of the space for the youth and to claim the right to voice in the society. So we are very lucky to have Somonicheat with us today. And I think she will try to tell us what, as a young person in this region, what the young would like to see for Southeast Asia or for ASEAN. Please, Somonicheat. Yeah, it's your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Premrudee. So to begin with, I would like to pay my sincere respect to panelists in this session, program organizers, senior friends, young activists, and those who are watching live right now. It's indeed a privilege for me to speak in this opening session today with seniors who have been working so hard to fight for the future for this generation. I would like to thank you and thank to everyone for providing me this opportunity to speak about the situations of ASEAN youth and how we as the youth see the future of ASEAN. So the theme of Mekong-ASEAN Environmental Week May 2021 will be Redesign ASEAN. People voice in the world crisis. As I believe that in order to redesign, youth voices in activisms are important, where attention needs to be focused, as they are the next generation leader, as well as the instrumental in driving social, economics, and as well as the cultural changes. You know, since I was born, I could hear only the fantasy of society that the government told us. The fairer of society, the social and economic growth, the investment, globalizations, and stuff, you know, these are something we learn from the books that they choose for us. And however, we still can see that the fairer society that they told us are fantasies, the global warnings and natural catastrophe are still unavoidable. The economic disparities cannot be addressed. And especially inequality in society is still happening every day. I think it's around 200 million youth aging from 15 to 34 years old among 660 million people in ASEAN, which I would say it's accounted for 1/3 of the total populations, are still receiving the education under the government approach. The approach toward the transforming of learnings and skill for youth in the entrepreneurs and innovative way. For instance, assessing the knowledge and skill with technology, the AI, the artificial intelligence in the education sectors, which are all driven by entrepreneurships and technologies. So here it shows how we need not to forget the reason why they invest in education and how they change our concepts, washing our brains and stuff. And growing in this new technology eras, youths are not provided fair of equalities of chances in accessing to education and stuff. For example, as you can see during this COVID-19, the closures of the school, the digital gaps, it caused us and to lose out on our education by having no internet, and some of them they don't have enough modern facilities such as smartphone, laptop to study at home. So I would say that youth can be the agents of change or just the consumerists in the natures. The involvement of youth on the right path of social work in all spheres of their life become imperative, especially for developing countries, such as the countries in the Southeast Asia. Youth, of course, can go a long way in the environment they are living in. So we are easily dragged by those people, mainly within these technology disruptions. It's also caused the diversity between us, just like the one vision, one identity, one community that our government has raised is unreal. And as we can see now, ASEAN is a region of diversity. And moving back to the technology disruptions, one day the culture, the foundation which the previous generation left for us will be all gone one day due to the technologies. So some of the youth, they would just rather wearing, cool clothes, using modern things to go on stage rather than risking their life to fight for changes in the society. That is why it's a very small numbers of youth become activists and fight for a better world with this restricted civic space. As you can see, authority has stepped up their crackdowns on youth, mostly on activists who engage in peaceful protest and activism. And the government often used draconian new law to be an excuse to prosecute and arrest them in a very obvious attempt in order to silence the voices and shut down the activisms. Amid this COVID-19, it's even getting worse since the government restrictions are harsh and we cannot even meet regularly like before due to the pandemics of COVID-19. This year, there are a few Cambodian environmental activists of Mother Nature Cambodia have been arrested, and they face between 5 and 10 years in prison, just like what Ms. Angkana has mentioned about earlier. And it shows that Cambodia government had stepped up its activities to silence activists who are peacefully advocating to protect the environment. It's not only happens in Cambodia, it's quite not different from the situation of activist youth-led movements in Thailand and Myanmar who are fighting for democracy within their countries. In Myanmar, youths know that the military return to power can be reversed a hard-won gains in human developments and the fundamental of everyone's freedoms in Myanmar. Their futures are all at stake, and while in Thailand, young activists demand the resignations of the junta leader, the constitutions, and the monarchical reforms. There are also other youth-led movements from other countries in ASEAN, besides from what I have raised, are also fighting every day for changes in their society. You know, their future have been destroyed and they are forced to give up their dreams. And some of them were even killed during the protests. And that is so sad to hear and think about the situation in some of the country in ASEAN. And other new generations of activists are still keeping their fights back against these brutal crackdowns on dissent, these widespread political censorships, and also the poisonous of social media operation and stuff. And opportunity for youth to engage in governance and participate in political and decision-making process are really necessary. On the other hand, there are still root causes and social actors within ASEAN that hinder our works and prevent the creations of youth-led movements and, you know, the strengthening of an environment where we are in right now. So we wanted to feel free, to feel supported, protected, so that we can continue our works. We are still facing risks that place us in a very vulnerable position. We have been excluded from the executions of social policies that directly influence our life now and in the future as well. So we obviously need an opening space for youth empowerment and democratic government to raise age of our voice equally, providing equal opportunities and you know, those things. And I believe that our youth in the next sessions of Mekong-ASEAN Environmental Weeks will raise more of their voices regarding our struggle and what we exactly need in our regions and what are the changes we would like to see in right now in our ASEAN. So yeah, thank you, and thank you again for inviting me today.
Thank you very much, Somonicheat. It is very important to hear from you. I think the point that you raised, of course, even when it's happened to many youth in Cambodia, but it's also reflecting the issues with the youth all over the region as well. Many of us have been really discussed about, you know, the opportunity that lost during the COVID-19 period, but at the same time, I think the issue that Somonicheat just raised about the security, you know, the possibility to feel, you know, secure in the society that you live is a very important for our futures of the ASEAN. So now it's nearly 11. Our time for this panel can continue until 11:30 actually, and I think now probably we can start calling for the questions. As you know, we are having at least the 3 channels broadcasting in Thailand, another 2 in Indonesia, 1 in Malaysia, and another 2 in Cambodia in the Facebook page. And so I would like to invite our audience who listen in the different Facebook page. If you have the question to our panelists, please write it down, and our team going to collect all the questions and send it directly to us on the stage. But when while we are waiting for this for the questions, probably I can go a quick round to ask the question to our panelists. I think what we would like a lot for this MAU 2021 is to find out for the answer. How can we redesign ASEAN? If any of you can reflect to us a little bit what you think about this word. You think the word redesign ASEAN is the possible one, and if it is, which aspect we should go first and how? Can you suggest us some of the concrete idea? Walden, you still here with us as well?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, yeah. Can I invite you first? I tend to try to have Walden speak first because I know you are not with us in the region and you must be pretty tired.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think I think the problem with the ASEAN system of governance is it's mainly government bureaucrats that determine the process. So in fact, even the economic sectors like business oftentimes don't have that much interest in it, except of course when they want certain specific demands like free trade agreements. So the question we have to make is, how can we get ASEAN away from the control of government bureaucrats? Because bureaucrats all think the same way, whether you're Indonesian, Filipino, Thai. Your main concern is stability, because bureaucrats fear change, okay? Bureaucrats fear change, especially from below. So this is really something that I would like to emphasize. How do we get the control of the ASEAN machinery away from the bureaucrats? Because all of them have an interest in the status quo across the countries, okay? And that's what we must understand, that they're concerned about the status quo and stability, which means that civil society must play a much more active role across borders. Civil society is in varying degrees of health and strength across the different ASEAN countries. Some it is weak, some it is strong, some it is active, some it is more passive. But if we can just unite in a more coordinated, formal fashion and put together, a more formal structure of civil society across borders that has specific demands, say, what are the key issues that ASEAN civil society should focus on in Myanmar, in the Philippines, in Thailand, etc. And then the whole of ASEAN civil society focuses on those issues. So what that means is that you have concerted pressure coming from throughout ASEAN civil society on specific governments. And of course, if you have a more organized structure of ASEAN civil society, then it can also be a channel for getting international pressure, to bear on the governments in ASEAN. So so I think that really needs to be top of the agenda, because yes, we have informal coordination among different civil societies in ASEAN, but we don't have a permanent working structure. And if we can get that together, I think that would be a big advance forward, so that people then, ordinary people throughout ASEAN know that there is a body that is lobbying for them, and this project, and if they know there is a body that's lobbying for them, that is a non-governmental body, but really ASEAN, I think that would assist a lot in terms of this process of redesigning ASEAN. So that's really where I think the pressure should be on. How do we get the control of ASEAN away from the bureaucrats? That's really the really big challenge. So we're talking about democratizing the regional structure of ASEAN and getting civil society input in a much more coordinated way into the process, because I don't think that is there at this point in time, but the potential is really great, because the potential is really great for civil society formal coordination in ASEAN, and maybe that's something that we should really be working on, instead of continuing to lobby separately on our separate issues, a non-responsive ASEAN bureaucracy. So that's my sense of what we should be doing. A body that can immediately and has a lot of credibility and legitimacy say to, for instance, right now, attack what the governments of ASEAN are doing in terms of their lack of energy and commitment to the process of democracy in ASEAN. So if we have an ASEAN civil society voice that is respected, credible, has the information, and can direct pressure at the authorities, I think that would really make a big difference at this point in time. So for me, that is the number one on the agenda at this point. And I think if we put our minds to it, we can, in fact, create an ASEAN civil society assembly that would be really provide the foundation for future trans-ASEAN democracy. So democracy starts in different ways in different countries, and in ASEAN, it could possibly start with a transnational ASEAN regional civil society body. Okay, so that's what I would say we need to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you, Walden. But probably one very quick continue questions for you. Seems like you are talking quite a lot about the relationship between the people, civil society, and our government, or the ASEAN itself. But what about, the sector that we all know that's, very, very powerful and probably more powerful than our government, the business, the corporate. You think, is there any sign from what you have been observed that, we have the better situation with them on the cross-border investment and so on and so forth?
Well, my sense is, that I have no clear answer to this at this point, because first of all, the business is oftentimes tied up to transnational interests. Okay, And business groups, for instance, the CP group in Thailand, has its interest in all these various countries at this point in time. And, however, my sense is that maybe we could be focusing on medium businesses, small businesses, businesses that have an interest in having a national market that is protected from this dumping by big transnational corporations. Even some national capitalist entrepreneurs that worry about their markets being destroyed. We should talk to them, because they are they are people who are mainly affected by free trade agreements. So my sense, especially now that we have seen, globalization has so many negative impacts, and how we have seen how our markets have been flooded with foreign investment and foreign goods. My sense is we can maybe create alliances with some business sectors, especially small and medium enterprises, and around the importance of protected national and regional markets. So that's my sense in which to go, because oftentimes even most people, let's put it this way, maybe for about 90% of the people in ASEAN are not really affected. They don't, how do you feel it now? They don't feel themselves as really part of a larger supranational body called ASEAN. For them, ASEAN, maybe the name of a product, okay? Maybe a chicken feed, okay? ASEAN doesn't reach them, okay? So, and even small businesses or medium enterprises don't really know what the bureaucrats are doing, opening up markets. No? So even business, I think we need to have familiarize them on what is happening on the ground. What are the bureaucrats pushing? What are these free trade agreements? And really do a big educational effort to say that, hey, this is all happening at this point. And while you may think that ASEAN, is the brand of a cement, okay, it is a body that is making an impact on your lives by destroying your markets. So, so I would say that for certain sectors, the more nationalistic sectors, the smaller sectors of business, there are possibilities of, an alliance with them to around more protected markets, more protected investments. But we should also realize that even as we deal with them, we have to get them to understand the demands of people, the demands of workers, and that the national economic interest is bound up with the organization of workers, the organization of migrants. Okay, so so I think that kind of strategy, I think, would be important to put into motion at this point in time.
Thank you very much, Walden. Thanks for your answer. I start to get some questions here. The first question is directly about the situation in Myanmar now. Since the armed conflict now is not only among the armed group, but the authorities, but the authority itself pointing guns to their people. What can we do as a citizen? Is there any international mechanism that people can really access to justice? I'm not sure if Kun Angkana would like to answer to this question a little bit, as you used to be one of the, at least the national mechanism for that.
Thank you, Kun Liang. I think at the minimum standard, no, what can we do is, sorry, I think we can support our neighboring people by at least the humanitarian support. And I think that for Thailand at the border, there's a lot of ethnic minorities who try to migrate to Thailand to escape from violence at the border. But Thailand not welcome the refugees. Yeah, Thailand. But Thailand give them like some help. For example, when they sick or affected and by wound or whatever, and they can access to the hospital. The Mason hospital have play a very critical role, to support the minorities group at the Myanmar border. And for myself, I often communicate with Thai Red Cross. I think Thai Red Cross play a very critical role during this conflict. Many times that the military in that area not allow the monk or the civil society to send food or other important things to our colleagues at the border. But the Thai Red Cross play a very critical role, and they supported. They also gave the COVID vaccine to the people at the border also. But I think for the big picture, how we can avoid the conflicts and violence or armed conflicts. I think this is a picture, the big picture of that ASEAN countries have to discuss very seriously. It's not only allow Madame Retno from Indonesia to talk to military government of Myanmar, but I think that all the ASEAN states should work together. Should work together, because you know that since Nargis, the typhoon Nargis, many years ago, ASEAN has one instrument is the R2P. You know, we can use this mechanism, the R2P, the responsibility to protect, so that the government have to protect their citizens. But when if the government cannot protect their citizens, so the government must allow their neighboring countries to help, or maybe if they cannot manage or they cannot prevent the violence in the country, they must allow the international community to give them any suggestion or the humanitarian support. So I think that for myself, I think that we have many instruments that we can do, but sometimes we blind to that, and we not want to interfere. Many times that we we mentioned about the non-interference policy of Asia, so that we don't want to interfere in other countries. But this is not interference. This is the life of our brothers and sisters in neighboring countries. So, for me, I think that it's time to amend the ASEAN Charter, because since the beginning of ASEAN Charter, now the new generation are growing up. So I think that we should we should include the new perspective, and if anything that obstruct us from being together and make our Asian people to be strong or solidarity, we should amended it and not let it to be in the ASEAN Charter again. I think this is one thing that we can do. Or how if the government or if ASEAN government ignore the humanitarian support, so how the civil society can do that? Because if civil society cannot provide food or other medicine or whatever, and sharing with our brothers and sisters, so how can we survive by seeing our colleague dying every day? I think it's very challenging. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angkana, for the answer. I have this one question, which I think they request to hear from both the senior activists and the young activists. So I would invite both Peter and Somonicheat to answer. The question is that it sounds like youth play important role as the leading engine for ASEAN in the future. I would like to hear from senior activists and young activists of this panel that how to engage youth in ASEAN. Peter, would you like to help us answering this question a bit first, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Premrudee. For me, I really strongly believe that the involvement of youth in activism is our future, because nowadays, like what you see, what happened during the pandemic and climate change that I was focusing on, we are not living in our own private world now. This is a global platform, and then there are a lot of, because of these globalizations, there are a lot of interactions. So there have to be collective involvement or more broader involvement from the youth and all that, and cross borders. Because this type of things that we're facing now is not a national thing, but global thing. So that is why we are trying in our organization, we're trying our best in order to get youth involved. And then probably it is what we have done is we start off by having a special youth wing of the organizations which cater for them. We even go and look at what attract them most. Like last year, for example, we even had rap competitions among the youth to attract them, because we know that in Malaysia, rap is very popular. When you look at the number of people who watch raps on the online on the YouTube, they are by the millions and watching this thing. So we asked them to have competition based on human rights issue and also on environment issue. So we're trying to get them on board. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I think we have this final round for Somonicheat, and then we can end our session very much on time. Somonicheat, please. Yeah, how ASEAN can engage the youth in your thinking?
Based on my opinion, I still saying that the way youth work in the social work is still in a very small number. It's still limited. As I mentioned, working on the right parts of social work is really necessary. So a lot of youth nowadays have been dragged by those business meant by those entrepreneurships and stuff, and they are trying to change our way into their way. So yes, that's why there's a very small number of us become activists, and we are still facing race that place us in a very vulnerable positions, as I mentioned earlier. So in order to do that, we obviously need an opening space for youth empowerment and democratic government to raise our voice to regarding on what we struggle and stuff. And I hope that there will be more opportunities and trainings and stuff for you to go on the right ways and go on the right tracks of social work.
Thank you so much. So I guess this is our final answer for our panel. Seems to me like we have too short time for this first panel, and I think
I should make a response. I think it should be the other way around. How can we senior activists learn from what the youth are doing?
all right.
I have in mind here what's happening in Thailand, where the youth have been taking the lead in making the government, in criticizing and making the government accountable. So I think we should also be focusing on what we can learn from the young people, because maybe we might learn more from them than from ourselves.
Definitely, that's the truth. And I think you know, more and more we try to invite them into this forum, like Mel. And this year, I think we will see more of our young friends face in different activity. Thank you very much, everyone. Once again, I would like to thank Walden, Bello, Peter Kallang, Angkana Neelaphaijit, and our friend from Cambodia, Kong Somonicheat. I think it was a very lively panel, and I hope you will stop by from time to time in our coming 6 days from now. And I'm looking forward for the next panel, which we see maybe most of the speaker already waiting there. Thank you so much, and bye for now.